blink if you like the questions the hosts are asking, that sort of thing. I feel like we're holding each other hostage.
You're in a podcast and the Stockholm syndrome kicks in. That you sympathize with your capturers.
Maybe the maturity assessments are bad. What am I doing?
Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. In this show, we talk about our experiences and lessons learned in enterprise architecture and business process management. What's Your Baseline is designed to be for everyone. Newbies who are just getting started with these topics, organizations who want to improve their EA and BPM groups and the value they get from it, as well as practitioners who want to get a different perspective and care about the discipline.
Each episode will tackle different key topics, providing context, background, best practices, and stories from the road, inviting you to learn from our challenges and successes, and demonstrating key tools to help you set up your practice and get the most out of it.
I'm your host, Roland Wolt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey JM, how are you doing today?
Hey Roland, I'm doing okay. You know, it's been a pretty hot summer for us here in Toronto, and I'm just excited to be beating the heat today, staying inside and keeping in the air conditioning. How you doing, my friend?
I hear you. I sit in my basement office where in winter I freeze my butt off, but in summer it's nice and comfy here. So I really, really love it.
Oh, yeah. I have a friend who's building a greenhouse, as they call it, which is one that has a naturally heating and cooling that is opposite to the season. Man, I wish I could get one of those things. It's such a fascinating engineering challenge that also leads to a lot of environmental support. It uses a ton less energy. And boy, he stays hot and cool when he wants to be, which is opposite to the seasons.
Yeah, which I haven't told you. I live in what we call an eco-village. So my house has all those nice green bells and whistles. And if I think about this is obviously the next maturity of building technology.
Oh, I see what you did there. I see what you did.
and speaking of which, JM, what is the topic of our conversation today?
Absolutely. Well, that's a good introduction. Today we're talking about maturity in BPA and EA, particularly the assessment of maturity, what sort of things to look for, how to approach it, and what to do with it. And of course, folks, we want to start by defining some terms so that everyone out there knows exactly what we're talking about. So first and foremost, Roland, tell me about the problem statement. Why do we even start the conversation around maturity? And then let's talk about what maturity actually is.
Yes, that's a good idea. It's always good to get things leveled and grounded. So
yeah,
I think the problem, I see multiple problems when I look at practices, architecture practices, process management practices, and whatnot. People are super motivated to do things, and problems that they might have is either they don't know where to start, right? What to do, so they focus on the things that they feel comfortable with. That might be modeling things or doing a certain type of analysis, and then they dig into this, or they're nerds, right? They love the technology, and now everything needs to fit into that technology, and that's their mission. These type of things, or they say, we have a little bit of success, but let's retire and let's have other people do this. Let's found a COE and a center of excellence, and the center of excellence will do everything, and we own the tool, and we're the masters of the world. And I'm of a big believer, even though I was leading a COE in one of my last jobs, that a COE is not the thing that solves all problems in the world, right?
No. So it can be a catalyst, right?
Yeah.
It can be a source of knowledge. It can be a great way of socializing information and with, enablement of people, with transmitting the passion for the technology and for approaches, but it doesn't actually solve an organization. And one of the things you want to take a really hard look at, is the maturity along a few different axes we're going to talk about today.
Because the whole reason is, how do you determine and plan your progress? Right? And it's not just one size fits all. I just read a LinkedIn conversation about, and I forgot who did the study, that organizations who implement a process mining COE are X% more successful than if they wouldn't have implemented it. That was a bold statement. And obviously all the consultancies jumped on it and said, yes, we need to do this,
I wonder why.
Well, I don't know. But anyway, so I don't know if that's really the real thing, if you will, right? As you said, a COE can be helpful, but I think it must be part of the bigger picture. And this is where maturity kicks in. But JM,
Right.
how would you describe maturity?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I think of maturity, I think it's a very charged term if you think about it, because maturity implies sort of like a childlike approach, like sort of looking down on people for not being as developed. But really what it is it isn't sort of a judgment. Instead it's a objective, or I guess it is subjective understanding of where you are in your pathway to your goals, or to what the industry has defined as good business, as good business practice, as good technology practice, as good organizational structure, design, and operations. I think it comes into a few different things. First and foremost, the thing we talk about a lot in this podcast is people, process, and technology. So helping to understand what you have in terms of the business structures that you need to achieve your goals, what you have in terms of the practices and the ubiquity thereof. So are people doing things in a standardized fashion? Are you managing them? Are you monitoring them? Are you measuring them? Are you acting on the results? And technology, do you have the components of your architecture required to achieve your stated business goals? And I think that when we talk about the specific categories and we go down the list later on, you'll see how these all sort of fit into just an overall picture of whether an organization is fighting itself or whether an organization is serving itself. And higher maturity organizations better serve themselves, and lower maturity organizations tend to get in their own way.
So to say it in other words, when you said people, process, and technology, you basically mean capabilities, right? Which capabilities do you have to have? And that's the theoretical abstract of that.
Absolutely. And I think that talks to some of the high level things we're trying to achieve as an organization. And I know, Roland, you published out this sort of 3-circle Venn diagram that we're going to go along with. And I want to have you dig into that. And once again, folks, as you might imagine, we'll have all these things in the show notes and the transcript and all that sort of stuff. You should be able to see this, so don't take notes as you're driving. But Roland, pop that up on your screen, and as people are listening to the podcast, hopefully you can take a look at it too and help understand it as we walk you through it.
Yeah, it's basically based on the experience that I did over the last 20-something years. There's 3 areas when it comes to implementations of architectures or implementation of practices, process practices, that you somehow need to find a balance. The first one is the content. Right. So what do you actually want to do? Do you want to do app rationalization? Do you want to do develop a process landscape, end-to-end processes, these type of things, process mining, whatever. Right. So it's the actual content that's mostly driven by your strategy, the objectives that the organization has, the projects that were defined, and all those wonderful things. If you remember the conversation that we had around the solution lifecycle, which comes in. And then you obviously have the second area, which we also spoke in the previous episode, which is defining the governance, right? How do we run the show here? Who's supposed to do what? The third thing, and now it comes full circle because we spoke about that as well in episode 17, is the adoption part, right? The people part.
Yeah.
So how do we create the visibility that we see where we are? How do we enable people to get to the point where they have to be? How do we communicate successes, as we heard in the previous episode with wonderful Lori? How do we communicate the successes of what we're doing, right? So it's content, governance, and adoption.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about adoption, this is something that ties back into maturity and to your previous comments about the COE, is that you can put, as you said, like to say, all the amount of wallpaper you want on the wall. If people aren't internalizing that, making it part of their way of working, their practice, then having this documentation and stating your goals might be a lofty, a nice thing to sort of say we've done, but it doesn't practically address what your organization needs to improve.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Because the question is, if we stick with that Venn diagram, you identify the 3 areas, but the ultimate question is, well, how are we doing on those 3 areas? What does that actually mean? And this is where the second concept comes in, and you and I spoke about this, is obviously it's based on capabilities. So now comes the big question, well, what are the capabilities that you need in an EA practice? right?
Yes.
And we will talk about those different models that might come into place. But on a nutshell, the way how I advised my clients is we looked at 5 different areas of capability. So the first one is foundational. What do I need, or how do I get started with that whole topic? Right. So capabilities in that area include things like selecting and managing a platform, right, where you put your repository in, or enable your people, or create interfaces to other systems. These type of things. Very, very close to putting things in place.
Yeah, like the organizational infrastructure or the foundation of the building.
Yeah.
You can't have a house without the foundation. It might not be sexy, but boy, is it important.
Which roles do we have? What do we need to teach people that they can do their job? And all those literally foundational things that you have to do.
Yeah.
The second big bucket, and it's a grand total of 5 buckets, right? And we wrote an article that I also will link in the show notes. The second big bucket is actually building and analyzing those architectures, right? And here I typically recommend to have a look at EA frameworks, such as TOGAF, for example, because they give you a good structure when you think about processes, applications, data, security, risk and controls, these type of things. And what you do is it's not only capture this, but also do an analysis within that. You want to, for example, when you think about the process view, you want to know which processes stink that we currently run, right? Which ones do we have to improve? Or when you think about applications, well, you want to do an application analysis, to find redundancies, to see what does our landscape look like and how does it fit with our ambitions, our principles that we've put up, and all those type of things. And I'm pretty sure at some point in time we're going to have a full episode about application rationalization and what are the different topics there. But the point is in that second capability area, you look at the what. You look at what do you want to capture and what do you want to analyze, right? And for that, you have those frameworks as a guideline.
Yeah, and if I can think of that, we've now set the foundation, and this is almost like the pillars and posts. Like we're setting the boundaries within which we are going to work. So it's developing on the foundations of what we put in place, but now we can work inside these with this as a guide. It's not the shell, it's not the wrapper, it's not the pretty stuff on the outside, but it is how we're going to do things.
Yeah, if you will. And then obviously now we've put things in place, right? Now we've answered the question, what is my architecture, right? The logical question is, well, what do I do with it, right? So the third capability group is basically then taking those areas and tie them together. Right, put them in connection. Connecting the dots was one of the mantras that I had in a previous job when I sold our services. These are things like, how do I create business IT alignment? How do I do my solution design, right? Where you have different aspects, different types of architects and specialists have to work together. How do I manage my solution portfolio? Right. So these type of things where you take those building blocks that you set up in the second capability area, and now you put them in context. Now you put them in relation with a certain purpose.
Right, so we're fleshing out the rooms of the house. This is our kitchen. We are going to make food here. Yeah. This is our living room. We're going to relax here and invite folks up. I love this. So we're defining the value, the use, and how they're connecting to each other. We have a door coming from our kitchen into our dining room to allow us to move food from the preparation area to the eating area. I love it. Let's go to number 4. What does that represent?
So now I'm curious how you take that house analogy going forward.
We both love architecture, both enterprise and real.
All right. So the fourth capability area is what I like to call visibility. EA visibility, process visibility, whatever you want to call it. Right. So the question is, how far are we? Are we 5% done? Are we 85% done? And you typically see those things in the form of obviously some reports that might feed into dashboards. Hint, hint. We had a short sessions about this, what makes a good dashboard. Or it could include snap analysis, something like health checks, right? Where you love to bring in consultancies, or use process mining if you talk about the process area, and you plug it in and you see what your as is looks like. So it's a question is visibility, right? How do I know where I am?
Well, and I think the good analogy for that is now we need to make that house into a home. And now we're living in there. We're actually eating in the dining room. We're cooking in the kitchen. Is it actually working for us? Are the burners too close? You can't fit a pot on them. Is the kitchen too far away from the dining room so things get cold before it hits the table? Now, there we are. I think the analogy is pretty stable from here. And let's talk about the fifth level here, the fifth capability.
That will be the next challenge for you. So the fifth one I typically like to call EA methodology, right? And that sounds a lot, but it's more like looking for trends, looking for frameworks, assessing, is that something for me? Should we actually care about a TOGAF? Should we care about a BPMN? Should we care about an APQC? Especially when you get started, you have no idea what those letters actually mean, right? So you read up on this, and depending on how it's presented, it seems super important and whatnot. What you need to build out is a capability where you can assess those things, and where you then can make the decision and say, oh yeah, this is the new stuff, right? Like we spoke with Mike Eidengren about SAFe, right? Scaled Agile Framework, where the question is that something for us? Is that relevant for us? And if it's relevant, well, how do we introduce this? So you need a capability how to plan those changes. You need to determine where you have to wrench to do this. And then you build up a plan to implement it, right? And there's different areas that you want to look at, things like frameworks, things like what the analysts spit out, what you see as trends, and all those type of things. So EA methodology as the fifth and last capability in that capability model.
And by the way, that does translate nicely to the house, of course.
Oh,
because now you've got a home, and now you're looking to get advice on interior design. What are the trends and the way in which things are structured? Recipes for the kitchen. How does it work? Should we be following this particular diet, this type of food? How do we store? How do we make? How do we do all these things? I can see that, and hopefully, everyone's getting the sense we're building this house of the organization, and it feels a little impersonal in some cases, in the sense that you're assessing the capabilities of the way in which your company works, but in a lot of ways, it is very personal. It brings you to the practitioner and their role, their place in the organization, and then rolls all of that up into how we group and manage the way we do business, of which you are intimately involved. And so it should be very personal. It should involve interviews so you can get a subjective view, and it should involve measurement so you can get an objective view. And I think those two put together make a really good picture. And we're going to talk about that in the practice of the how, what sort of models there are in place. But the other thing I want to talk about here is, as we close of this first section, is when you should monitor and measure your capabilities, when you should assess your maturity. And from my perspective, there has to be compelling events. Those are things that are really important to understand. What's happening in your organization that disrupts the natural flow of business? Sometimes it can be involved in a transformation project. There are large strategy initiatives that get put into place. They'll normally have a timeline. They might be associated with new leadership. They may be associated with new lines of business that you're introducing. Those are pivotal moments for the business, compelling events where you can take a chance to take stock of things. And so now you can use that compelling event as a driver to get executive level support for these sorts of maturity assessments, because you're going to need to do more than just looking inside. This isn't a Kaizen, like one person continuous improvement thing. These maturity assessments do often involve getting information from across the business, across different stakeholders to whom you may not get access normally. So compelling event is a great way to build that.
I actually beg to differ, right?
Really?
Yeah, I think this is a regular exercise that you should do, right? Is it something that you do on a daily basis? No, right? Is it something that's triggered by an event? Yeah, maybe, right? But if you just focus only on the event, you might lose sight of linearity. Right, because I think what you have to do is you have to check in on a regular basis, and that might be yearly, or whatever, every 18 months or whatever time frame you set yourself. And a typical good hook for that is when you look at your annual budgeting, right? Because there the question comes up like, well, what do we want to do next year? Right? And how much money do we need for this? And if you have a maturity assessment and a roadmap after that, well, guess what? It's easy to answer that question, right? You can show the progress, what you did, and you can show what are the next things that you want to do going on forward. And therefore, you're asking for this and that money. But having said that, the ultimate question is, and we're going to talk about this in the next segment, is, well, how do you measure that?
That's a good question, Roland. How do you measure it? There are so many different models available. We're going to cover that in our next section. But before we get to that, I wanted to put a quick call to action. Think about your organization, dear listeners. When did you last take a hard look at your practices and capabilities? Oh, geez, when was the last time you did an assessment of maturity? Have you ever done one? And let's take a hard look and think about it. Where do you think you'd stack up on the scales we're about to introduce? You think you're doing well? You think you have a little ways to go? We'll leave you for a second to think about that and come back with our second section, the how.
And welcome back. In the previous section, we were talking about, just as a little recap, we were talking about maturity and why it's important to have a look at maturity. We also looked at the three areas that might be of focus: content, governance, and adoption. And then we looked at the 5 pillars of capabilities that you might want to look at. We left you alone with a question about when and how to measure it. And JM, if I might throw that question over the fence to you, well, what are metrics that you would look for measuring maturity?
Well, I actually want to start us off the conversation about the different models that are available. There are a bunch of different metrics. They talk to different processes, different architecture capabilities, different organizational capabilities. But let's just start by sifting through the different possibilities on how you'd like to do this assessment. And for that, what I want to do is call up a few different places that I found, things that I've liked. Now, there are consultancies who will give you maturity models. A perfect example is someone like a Gartner, sort of analysts that will try and assess things on different levels based off of, for instance, BPM maturity. Whether or not you're level 1, you're aware of your process. Level 2, you've coordinated your process. Level 3, you have cross-boundary process management. Level 4, goal-driven processes. Level 5, optimized processes. That's an example of what one of the things Gartner has put out on there. And you'll find a similar thing with something like APQC. So besides the analysts and consultancies, things like APQC have things like initial, managed, defined, quantitatively managed, optimized. You're starting to see a pattern here. You could also go with ITIL. You could also go with COBIT. You can go with a ton of these different like maturity assessments, even with boutique consultancies who have their own special sauce on measuring maturity. And this happens for process, it happens for architects, it happens for organization. They all sort of boil down to the same kinds of levels. And I'm going to talk about this in the way that I think ITIL does it, and just kind of read from their book, because it's something that I think is really powerful. And they introduce a level 0, a couple models do. Level 0 is really where a lot of organizations start. Their processes are not fully functional. Their purposes are not being achieved. Their architecture isn't fully functional. It is not doing what they want. And there's, that's where we really get these things, these sore thumbs sticking out and saying we need to make a change. Level 1 is where a lot of people start to have an awareness of where they actually need to make the change. Because level 0, it's a lot of chaos. People don't necessarily know what's going on, and the awareness is quite varied based on the role. Number 1 is the practice is not well organized, and so processes and architecture are not done as a collective effort. It's very ad hoc. And in doing so, that ad hoc, sort of one at a time execution will occasionally achieve purposes, will occasionally function the way you want it to, but it's always incomplete and it's essentially random. So whether or not you're successful isn't designed, it is happened upon. Level 2 is when you start to have the first level of at least structure and control, where your practice is organized. It systematically achieves its basic purposes, and you've defined and set out your resources and your activities and your organization in order to align them to achieve your purposes at a very basic level. That's level 2, and at least you're doing it on purpose and it's happening fairly consistently. Level 3, and once again, we're going from level 0 to level 5, is where you have a practice that is defined and achieves its purposes through organization, through structure, through dedicated resources, and understands that practice, those processes, that architecture has connections across different functions to other parts of the business, other parts of the organization, clients, customers, partners, and they're integrated into things like service management. They're integrated into interactions with each other. That's sort of on a level 3, and that's where you're truly managing things. You're truly getting a hold of all your processes and controlling that in a structured way with a mature method behind that. Level 4 starts to take in something we've talked about on this podcast a few different times, and I know that looking back on that, we really started a couple of our friends out at level 4. Well, that is when we start to take data into account. That is when we measure. So the practice is operational, it's managed, but we are using quantitative data to help to drive our decision making. That's when we move from these sort of best practices, best ideas, somebody's back of the napkin drawing, to evidence-based decision making. And evidence-based decision making is the driver for evolution from a practice perspective, from a process perspective, from an organization perspective. You let the data be the source of truth and you trust the data. And then, of course, level 5 is the pinnacle of a lot of maturity. And that's where we talk about not just that you're managing a practice, not just that it achieves your goals, not just that data drives your decision making, but that you are continuously improving this practice using data as an everyday driver for excellence. And so when you aren't, comfortable to sit still, you don't say, hey, I've done this, I'm being satisfactory to the business. No, you are using that because you have a stable platform upon which to draw to constantly improve. We have an expression, I used to do a lot of ski boarding, and there was an expression when you went off a jump, which was we used to do tricks and stuff in the air. You could always tell what you could do and how you were going to perform in the air simply by how well you took off. And once you have that stable base, you can do anything. If your jump is excellent, your landing's going to be fine. You can do anything in midair, and that's where that sort of continuous improvement thing relies upon those first, the level 1s or 0 to 5 or 4 to be able to get you to that point where you've got that solid takeoff. Then you can continuously improve, knowing you have a solid landing waiting for you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Roland?
Oh, it does make sense. Yeah. The one scale, and you're right, they're all somehow similar. The one scale that I would love to use and used in the past, and I will talk about that in a few minutes, is the CMMI model. And maybe just because CMMI stands for Capability Maturity Model Integration, right? But in a nutshell, the CMMI model has basically 5 steps, and to oversimplify, not to repeat yourself because it's in the same vein. Level 1 is the individual hero, who pulls it off. Level 2 is the group of people who come up with their own standards that they have. Level 3 is it's organization wide. Level 4 is, just like you said, it's data driven, right? So you measure what you do. And level 5 is you build in the feedback mechanism so that you enable continuous improvement, right? So you have the well-oiled machine without any holes in there. In general, my opinion is pick one, right? It's same for content, right? It's not important, well, it is important, obviously, what the content is, which capabilities do you look for and how do you structure it, or how you measure it. But I think it's even more important to say, yep, you bring everybody in the organization on the same page. We all measure the same thing. We all talk about apples, or we all talk about oranges. And you don't have the outliers who say, yeah, but, that needs to be this, and but this needs to be that,
Yeah.
So get the consensus, I think, is the interesting thing that everybody buys into it.
And also remember that your maturity is not the be all and end all of the organization. You are assessing maturity at an individual process or practice level or individual capability level of the organization. So you may score differently on different capabilities, and the collective number may not be what you want it to be, but what you're trying to improve is something that will meaningfully move the needle for your performance, right? Otherwise, you're going to be improving capabilities simply because they're not doing so well or they don't look as good. That's not actually what you need. The perfect example, let's take a look at the categories that Gartner espouses: organization and culture, process competency, methodology, technology and architecture, metrics and measures, governance. You don't have to move the needle on all of those. In fact, some of these you can keep at a lower level if it doesn't help you to have a higher level of maturity. Because Roland, correct me if I'm wrong, but maturity is expensive. It's expensive to improve what you do because it takes organizational will, it takes capital, and it takes people to be able to draw upon experiences and put them into practice. You don't want to have to pay for everything to get better all at once. Optimization is the death of excellence.
I think it's not like whatever, the 99.99999% availability of apps, or servers. I think it's a little bit different. But either way, that's what I meant, You mentioned the Gartner categories. What I don't really like that much on it is it's very specific. I think what we said in the section 1, where we looked at those 5 buckets, I think that's a much more flexible thing. And what I did in a previous job, we developed an EA maturity assessment, right? Which is obviously a good thing when you're a consultant. You go into a client and you just want to get the lay of the land, and you want to understand how the organization does it. That's obviously very helpful. The positive side effect is obviously you demonstrate your thought leadership and your methodology if you can show something that impresses clients in sales situations, and when you show up that they don't think you just make it up on the fly. So what we did is we did a version 1 of it, and we used those 5 capability areas that I mentioned in our first segment. In all reality, those 5 segments decompose into 24 level 2 capabilities. And those decompose to a grand total of almost 150 sub-capabilities.
And here's the question, Roland. Do you need to have everything put out there? Otherwise, you can't do what you want?
No. That's not the point. That is why you have those higher level categorizations. But the point is, you should have a capability model for your organization. You should know, how do I decompose this? What do I want to do? So what we did now is we obviously had that formatted nicely and all these type of things. But we went in there and said, okay, let's do an assessment. Let's go through those 5 areas on different points in times. And we're just going through and said, hey, how do you do, for example, your enablement, right? With all those sub capabilities that you had underneath. And for each of those, we rated them. We said, oh, it's non-applicable, or it's somewhere between a 1 and a 5, right? Based on what I just said, individual hero, group definition, organization-wide, blah, blah. And we left a field where we took notes, right? Where we noted down what was the evidence that brought us to, JM, you're a level 1. Sorry to say,
That's great, yeah.
At some point in time, you have to obviously go back to the client and tell them that their baby is ugly, right? So you better have some evidence. So we did this for all 5 areas. We took notes, and then we built in a completeness check, right? Because in that thing, you obviously want to know, did I forget something? And that was actually determined with a little bit of conversation up front. As you rightfully so, noticed 150 capabilities is quite a bit, and not everybody does everything. So what we did is we, on that 24 capability level 2, we had the conversation with the client in advance and said, look, are you actually doing this? And the answer might be no. So then we took it out. If they don't do app rationalization to stick with that, we just took it out, right?
Makes sense.
The second thing that we did is, in coordination with the client, in each of those sections where you had lower level capabilities, we made sure that those capabilities summed up to 100%. So they could put focus on and said, okay, of those 5 things that I see in that subcategory, well, guess what? This is the most important. That's 40% of the deal, right? So therefore, the other 4 had to split up the remaining 60% in some form or fashion. So again, we did it on a high level, sorted out things that they didn't do. And then on the lower level, we said, okay, put your priority in there. What's important for you, Mr. Client? And we obviously gave some advice on this.
And I think that leads us to one of the things we've talked about before the podcast as we were preparing for this, which is this idea of current state and target state. Because you're kind of defining, the capabilities you have, what matters to you, so your priorities, and that helps you to better understand where you need to get to achieve your business goals, right?
Yeah, that was you jumped one step. Right. So that was just getting it in.
Right.
Obviously, we did our assessment and we said, okay, you're a 1 to 5 in all these things. It calculated everything. It gave you obviously a score based on the 24 capabilities, the level 2. And we also had a look if something was sticking out, and didn't smell right at that point in time. But we had a raw result. The next step then was to go to the client and present the result and say, oh, this is where we think you are. And a client might disagree. And he might say, oh, you rated me a 1 here? Hell no, we're a 4 or a 5, And then obviously the conversations came about, what was your evidence? Why did we come to the 1, right? And as you said before, it's a little bit of doing interviews with people, but also reviewing, for example, standards, right? Reviewing artifacts that they have created. Does that application landscape or that data model, does that look like it's following a certain industry agreed upon standard, or was it just made up, right? So those type of things. And what we built in there was something like an override for a client. Right. Typically, we came into an agreement and we said, okay, you think you're 4, I think you're 1, well, maybe you're 2, right? But if a client really existed, we had another column in that tool where we said, okay, client's opinion, 4, right? And then obviously it recalculated everything based on what the override came in. But to come to your question, JM, what we did then, or what the tool then automatically did is it created a spider diagram, right? So, and here comes now the flip, right? We assess those 5 capabilities, but to make it actionable, we overlaid those 3 Venn diagram areas: content, governance, and adoption on top of it. Because when you think about foundational capabilities is to manage a platform. That's a governance stuff, or enablement. That's a governance thing. While when we talk about how do you do solution portfolio management, guess what? That's content, right? And all those type of things. So we overlaid this, and the spider diagram, if you think about it, it had something like a circle with 5 circles in the background, right? And we drew something like pizza slices in there. And said, oh, we took out certain things, so we don't have 24 capabilities, but it's just 15 that we assess. But of those 15, the distribution between content, governance, and adoption is like this. And the background picture of the spider diagram showed that then, and it obviously plotted out what the ranking was. So that was obviously very powerful as is a statement. This is how we see yourself. But then to your question, well, what do you do next, right? What we also did there is it plotted out those 24 capabilities and their ratings, and we had 2 more columns to the side of it. Today in a year from now, in 2 years from now, or even more if you wanted. And then you could put in your ambition. And at that point in time, it was more like, okay, where do you want to go, Mr. Client? Right? What is important for you? Because your organization might have certain specifics, because there's certain players or certain rules that you have to follow through that determine that you put more focus on this over that. Mm-hmm. Right? But the idea is obviously to say you have that as is snapshot in the spider diagram, and then you mapped out where you want to be in a year or two from now. And that delta, right, that was agreed upon. And then we transferred it and said, okay, what do we need to do to close that gap between whatever in this category, maturity level 2. And by the way, the recommendation initially was everything should be level 3, right? It should be organization-wide being defined.
Oh, okay.
To say, okay, how do we close that gap? And that helped us then to plan the projects and the teams and everything that needed to be done going forward. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I think that's a really good segue for us to move into the next of our segments, unless you had anything else you wanted to talk about in this little interjection here. The next thing we want to talk about, folks, in our value section is going to go into actually making a change. But before we make that change, we're going to ask you a couple of questions just to ponder the conversation we've had so far. So think about the categories we're mentioning, some of the things that we've talked about from a maturity level perspective, some of the things we've talked about from a ranking and score perspective. Where do you think that you and your organization stack up? Maybe we can take a look at the graphics on the website and assess them based off of what we've published. And if you take a sort of back of the napkin assessment of yourself, are you satisfied with this result? Roland mentioned that, if everything should be level 3 in maturity, are you there yet? And if not, well, let's see if we can help you get there with our next section, the value.
Just to bring us back. So in the first section, we spoke about maturity, we spoke about the capability, we spoke about the Venn diagram. In the second section, we spoke about how to measure things, the different things like CMMIs and all these things. And we had that example of the little product that we built in one of my previous employers to make that operational. But now I'd like to ask you, well, what do we do with it? If I've done that assessment, and I hinted it a little bit. Of course, you use it for project planning, but I think there's a little bit more, isn't there, JM?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the last thing you mentioned in our previous section is perhaps one of the most important, which is the word gap. Mm-hmm. How far away are we on each of these capabilities, on the measured scores of 0 to 5 or 1 to 10 or however you want to score? It doesn't really matter. Whatever model you're using, the delta, that gap, is going to give you some indication of the kind of effort required. So when you're taking, let's say you're moving from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3 or a 3 to a 4, these small things you're trying to implement, these are the kinds of things that you can set out a plan for, and you can do a project that, that's maybe a smaller initiative. You can take individual practitioners, help bring their levels up, help them spread the knowledge organically. There's a lot of things we can do. Sometimes it'll involve a technology implementation, but generally it's building on previous experiences. Generally it is about an evolution, and people can see and feel that. When you have very large gaps, and I mean, Roland, maybe your experience is a little different, but I work with clients who are trying to move from like a 1, where process is essentially random when it's even captured, to something like a 4. Mm-hmm. They've got a big jump. They're saying, I want to go to data-driven decision making, and seeing that gap of a 3 on the assessment that's a heavy burden. That's an anchor.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have to drag not just a practitioner, but a whole organization through a transformation that is really wide reaching. People, process, technology all have to vastly change, and that's going to involve a whole bunch of change management.
And I think that's a huge step, and I think there might be more ambition than capability in those organizations.
Yes.
You know, because you definitely, there's dependencies between the capabilities. You know, just like your little house example, you need to have the foundation in place before you can build the studs, before you can define the rooms and all that type of stuff. So there's dependencies between them. And what I typically like to do when talking to clients is I try to scale back their ambition a little bit by focusing on how, by the way, there's the dependency, you need to do this first and you need to do that first, right? But obviously they want something really, really deeply, right?
Yeah.
I want to give them something like that, but then I frame it in a way, hey, why don't we just do a pilot? You know, we're looking for a friendly area, and the topic of the day is process mining, the new hot stuff, you know, whatever. And you just look for a friendly area to say, let's get your governance in place, let's get your existing content migrated into the new tool and all those semi-boring things. But we're going to do a pilot with that exciting new technology in that one area where we know we already have data and don't have to look for. Right. And typically clients are pretty responsive to this because they understand, yes, there are dependencies, and yes, it's a big lift if you want to really move multiple levels. Right. And you should see that as a marathon and not as a 100-meter sprint.
Oh, it's a great way of putting it, a marathon and not a sprint. But the other piece of the puzzle here is, you talked about as a pilot, is understanding and assessing whether or not that actually is going to provide value for you. Pilots are a great way of judging whether or not your goals are aligned with your needs. Aha, that's a fun one.
Or you find holes, to stick with that process mining example. You know, you might discover that you had some ideas about how well your data is structured and how easy it is to find, and then you realize, oh damn, that's a huge lift that we have to do just to schmooze the data to be able to do this. Right? So you identify actually more work, more blockers, if you will, for increasing your maturity, where you have to talk to people and work with people that you even didn't have on your radar.
And one of the things that I do, because we want to talk about, you know, what should you do about this, is try and hone in on what actually matters by knocking things out. So we actually ask the tough questions a lot of the time. How much does this actually matter to you? Could you go on? Could you survive? Is this going to be okay if nothing changes, if other things change around it, but this thing doesn't change? So one of the things we try and say is your current level of maturity in this particular capability working well enough for you in your business? Does it not create a significant negative impact to your ability to deliver to customer, deliver to internal services, and deliver to partner? And
just keep in mind, sometimes good enough is good enough.
Yeah.
You know? So don't try to scale more than you might need. And I'd rather would advise you to say, okay, if it's good enough, move on to another area where you have some work to do, because that lifts the whole boat. And sometimes people just, forget this because they like what they do. You know, they want to become the expert in this topic and all those type of things.
Absolutely. And the other thing you want to talk about is the value of the change. I mean, we had an episode of the podcast about determining business value, but if you're moving a maturity level, let's say you're moving from a 3 to a 4, so you're actually bringing data in on a particular capability, what does it actually provide to you? Like, what's the business value of that change that you can perceive? And let's actually score that. Let's see if that business value and the cost of making up this gap combined actually provide a good case for change. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe the business value is relatively low, but it's a cool idea. Don't buy cool ideas. Cool ideas don't serve customers. Cool ideas serve individual practitioners and companies, and that's not a good business goal. So the next thing is we want to make the maturity change. And that's the other thing, is we want to talk about building a case and also building the framework for making a change to your maturity. And that's a really important thing. You want to build this into projects. So acknowledge the need, define the value, understand what you're going to transform, and start the sort of scaffolding for projects.
Yeah, and I think the benefit of doing a maturity assessment is, since it's capability based, And if you want to say that the 3 Venn diagram thing is more communication, while the capabilities are the content. Since it's capability based, you can go and say, oh, how do we do this? Right? What's my capability configuration? Is when you think about it, bronze, silver, gold, as a measure of fidelity. Is bronze enough?
Yeah.
Right? Or do we need to have a golden version of this? So the planning that you do is basically on that capability configuration level, right?
Yes.
Because that also might be deployed, and I mentioned that example in a previous podcast where we wanted to implement a new system for our internal audit offering that we have, where in the US, we had about 3,500 internal auditors in our organization, while in the Netherlands, we had like 35. And obviously, the needs of the 35 were significantly different than the ones of the 3,500.
Right.
So that would be one way, obviously, to plan your progress and then to show, oh yeah, by this date, we will have this configuration in place. And our plan is to go from, whatever, we put bronze in place. And our plan is to go to silver because good enough is good enough, right? And we have that a quarter later, right? But then we shift focus and we do something else.
Right. So then I would say that when you're drawing this up in a spreadsheet form or something like that, you would have the capability, your assessments and weighting, the final score, your planned score, the gap, and then you'd continue that line along to what are you going to do to make up this gap? When is it going to happen? What projects you're going to have? How those projects are going to interact? How they're going to leverage people, process, and technology to improve? How you're going to communicate this? How are you going to enable people? This all just becomes one big line of transformation information.
And in your plan, you also have a vertical line that says, this is a point in time when we do a stop and do the next assessment, right?
Yes.
And really have a look back and do the retrospective and say, did we accomplish what we wanted? Did we improve our maturity, right? And then you adjust the plan for the next period.
I completely agree. And Roland, you've done this a whole bunch of times. The last thing I want to leave our friends in the audience with is some of the lessons learned, because I know this has been a big part of your practice. So tell me a couple of your tips and tricks for people who are getting started, because it seems like a daunting task, but it's so important in building a good business case and building a good business.
Yeah, I think it's relatively easy for somebody with limited Excel capabilities to build a maturity assessment in a spreadsheet, do the calculations, all that stuff that I described in our second section.
Yeah.
I think the takeaway is, as we always say, you deal with people. So when you do that assessment, you speak to an individual. JM, tell me, how do you do this? Show me your artifacts, show me your standards, these type of things. But then JM, because he's an expert in that topic, will obviously show his best side, because nobody wants to be seen as somebody who doesn't know their stuff or doesn't have their act together, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean that the organization is at the same level, right? So when you interview people, and that's just pure statistics, your sample versus the full data set, your organization might look differently. So always keep in mind, you talk with people, you have an individual you're talking to. You're not talking about the organization. So now, and unfortunately I didn't get to this, that would have been awesome if we had our little tool to say, JM sits in this group, right? Oh, I also interviewed 5 other guys from the same group. So now I do the average of that group, right? Or to aggregate it even more to see, hey, we did that assessment with 20 groups in that organization. So you come up with an overall score for the organization, but you might see some of the org units who are awesome, who are on a 5, while others are on a 1 or even worse. Right, that will have obviously an impact on your plan going forward. Because, if the average is 3 because you have a 1 and a 5, right? But in all reality, you have some rock stars and you have some parts in the organization who need more than help, right? You obviously focus on a different area. So on that group that needs the help, right?
Yeah.
And you tell the other guys, good job, guys, do less of that, help us with that group.
And that's another thing about interviewing for capability assessments or assessments in general. Remember that when you're interviewing people, you are very likely to get extremes. Not a lot of people will respond, it's fine. You'll get people complaining about lack of capabilities, and you get people covering for lack of capabilities. It's very often you'll get those sort of flip-flopping, okay, I hate this, I love this, I hate this, I love this. You're trying to find a measured balance that gives you a real assessment of score. And that's why things like averages are helpful, because they're going to help to filter out those outlier responses, which you kind of expect to get.
Yeah, and I highly recommend that everybody who's listening to that show at this point in time will have a look at some Statistics 101, right, to figure out what are the good measures and how you calculate those to make your case, and the nerds will not count you out. The other thing is maybe a last hint for those of you who work in consulting organizations. Doing maturity assessment is obviously, as I said before, a good point to show credibility to the client. Oh, you know what you're doing. Oh, you've done that before, So that's obviously great. But obviously, if you scrub all those data afterwards, so you have your current client, obviously, as we discussed over the last 15 minutes, but then you scrub it. And you say, that was a client in the finance industry. That was a client in utilities. That was a client in governance. And we've done 7 assessments in that industry. How does the average look like? So you can take that type of information and package it in a report, right, that you publish as one of your marketing examples, and say, hey, so-and-so consultancy did the report of maturity or state of maturity in this industry. And I'm pretty sure that will be also interesting for future prospective clients that you might have.
And that sort of gets into the idea of benchmarking, right? When you start to aggregate results across the whole industry. That's a fantastic idea for consultants. I'm sure people are doing some of that already, but remember, aggregate and benchmark, understand where you should be, and follow those sorts of guidelines. That's great.
It also helps, and that's the last tidbit that I have, is because it also helps the discipline. And I said it in other meetings, in other sessions that we had. EA is 30, 40 years old, right? And I think it's still not defined as a discipline in a way that is accepted by others. And I think one of the key reasons for that is because there's no universally agreed on standards how good looks like being defined. Right, everybody does something, everybody measures it differently and whatnot. And the only thing when I was looking for discipline benchmarks or discipline good best practices was a study from 2009 that I found by Strategy Ant, which was the strategy arm of PwC. And I found it really interesting, and I need to see if I have it. I'm happy to link to it if I find it. They looked at their research, came back with 5 things that organizations could do to improve it. And what I've seen in all reality are things like that organizations choose topics that are easy to tackle. Oh yeah, we need to have governance defined, for example, right? So we need to write a big book that puts out all the rules, who does what, when, where, and the quality standards and all that type of stuff. That research that I just mentioned, in those 5 areas that they found of correlation of success to what they do, governance was just on the 4th place, right? Ooh. So there were 3 others that they said, yeah, if you do this, that brings you much closer to success than defining your governance. They didn't say you shouldn't do it. They just said prioritize it differently. And I think that is exactly the conversation that we as part of the discipline need to have to say, okay, how do we make things right? What is the things that we hold ourselves accountable for?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great question back to our audience, right? Think about your capability. What do you want to do about your capability shortfalls, those gaps? What do you want to do about them? Are they things that you should be addressing? Should they be prioritized? Where do you think that addressing them will provide value to your business, your clients, and your partners? And lastly, given what we've talked about, how are you going to get started taking your maturity assessments and turning them into real action to improve how you do business? We'll leave you for a moment and come back with the conclusion of today's episode.
So welcome back, and I have to say you made it. We're at the end of our show. So what we did is today, just to recap it before we sent you home, is we looked at why is maturity assessments, why are they important, what is maturity? We brought in the concept of the 3-circle Venn diagram: content, governance, adoption. We came back with the capability model with the 5 big buckets. What do I need to set it up? What is my architecture? What do I do with it? How do I know where I am? And what do I need to know about methodology? And then we spoke about different ways of measuring, talking about CMMI and all those things. And I shared a little example of projects that I did on that. And then lastly, we rounded it up with actually the value. How do you determine if your maturity is working? Remember, good enough is good enough. How do you do the planning and all these type of things? And how do you use the maturity assessment as a regular checkpoint in your transformation roadmap? Does it cover everything roughly what we did speak about in the last 60 minutes-ish?
Yeah. Well, I think it gives us a great starting point for all of our audience. In the break, Roland and I were talking a little bit about that. This is the kind of thing that it doesn't take too much to get started. You need a little bit of Excel skills, but what it does take is a commitment. And you need to have people committed to giving you good information, and you need to be committed to using that information to drive change. And that's hard, but it's valuable. You got to believe us that it's a real driver for transformation in organizations, and not just transformation is a scary word, but enhancement, new capabilities, new possibilities, and better business operations. And talking about nice things that people love to have is another thank you to our wonderful audience, because you've given us the lovely following that we've got. I think we crossed a couple more thresholds of audience listenership, and I got to tell you, Roland and I couldn't be happier to see the wonderful response to this podcast. You've helped encourage us to continue on our journey of creation, and as always, we love to get feedback from you. So reach out to us through voice messages on Anchor, by email at hello@whatsyourbaseline.com, through rating us and leaving us reviews in your podcatcher of choice, and of course visiting the website whatsyourbaseline.com, or specifically for this episode, whatsyourbaseline.com/episode 27. Well, folks, for now, my name is J.M. Erlinson.
And I'm Roland Wolt.
And we'll see you in the next one.